We're excited to announce that our very own podcasting platform, Zencastr, has become a new sponsor to the show. Check out the podcast's discount link in our show notes and stay tuned for why we love using Zen for the podcast.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is Dr. Alan Garfinkel. I'm the president and founder of the California Rock Art Foundation. And what we do is we identify, evaluate, manage, and conserve rock art both in Alta California and in Baja California. We conduct field trips, we have trainings, exercise, we do research, and in every way possible, we try to preserve, protect, and coordinate treasures of Alta and Baja California rock art, of which there are many and diverse. We also work closely with Native Americans and partner with them to recognize and protect sacred sites. So for more info about the fabulous California Rock Art Foundation, you can go to carockart.org. Also, I'm open to give me a call, 805-312-2261. We would welcome sponsorship or underwriting, helping us to defray the costs of our podcasts, and also membership in California Rock Art Foundation. And of course, donations, since we are a 501c3 nonprofit scientific and educational corporation. God bless everyone out there in podcast land.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast. Join us every week for fascinating tales of rock art, adventure, and archaeology. Find our contact info in the show notes and send us your suggestions. Hello and welcome to the Rock Art Podcast, episode 66 with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. Today, Dr. Garfinkel talks about the concept of resource depletion and its relationship to the proliferation of religious intensification. Hey everybody, Chris Webster here, and that means I'm interviewing Dr. Alan Garfinkel once again about a scintillating rock art topic. Doctor, welcome to the show. Welcome to your show.
Professor Webster, it's always a joy, and it's always interesting, and we always tend to major on the minors, deal with all kinds of esoteric topics and interesting and intriguing subject matter. And we've been doing this for, I guess, well over a year now, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a year and a half, I think. So we're knocking down the download. It's looking pretty good. So I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but I was looking at the end of 2021 and we're hitting a lot of ears, which is great. And which means you guys, the listeners, are sharing the episode. So if you subscribe to our newsletter, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go to arcpodnet.com and just scroll down the page a little bit and you'll be prompted to sign up for the newsletter. It's just a pop-up that shows up. Every Friday, you'll get an email from me or from the APN that says the podcast that we have. So we encourage you to share that email so other people can listen to the podcast or just tell people about it. I just talked to somebody who joined us as a member the other day who found the APN membership because she loves rock art and was listening to the Rock Art Podcast and then subscribed to become a member. So that's fantastic.
And it's amazing because you wouldn't think that the Archaeology Podcast Network would have a monopoly on this, but we are the only rock art podcast in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. It's crazy.
And, yeah, when you type in Rock Art Podcast, we're it.
That is true. I'm sure some other shows, that have an archaeological or historical topic.
Oh, yeah.
They discuss rock art occasionally, but you're right. There's nothing else that's focused solely on rock art and things surrounding rock art. So, so speaking of, what are we talking about today? I mentioned in the intro, but let's get into it.
Well, this is a rather interesting topic and one that I've published on a number of times. And it also is a rather broad topic, yet something that many people perhaps are unaware of. And when I've given presentations about it, I call it sacred ecology, resource depression, or aboriginal overkill. Well, that sounds pretty esoteric. What I'm talking about is there is an understanding or an expectation that Native people are rather religious and rather spiritual, and they are very much so. And I have tremendous respect and veneration for them. Yet that particular expression does not necessarily avoid issues regarding excessive harvesting of selective species, be they animal species or invertebrates or large mammals or what have you. And this has been a scientific controversy regarding the expression of native people and their behaviors for quite a while. One of the biggest and longest and continuous controversies surrounds whether, when human beings first entered into North America, the New World, some 12 to 15 or even 20,000 years ago, did that entrance into the New World contribute to the excessive harvesting or extinction of megafauna? In other words, the big animals, the proboscideans, the elephants, and the other large game animals like that Smilodon californicus, and those huge animals, the cave bear, and the mammoth, and the mastodon, and all of them. What happened was during this period, following about the time of the late Pleistocene, they all became, many of them, unbelievable numbers of these animals became extinct simultaneously. And Paul S. Martin, who is the most famous advocate of that particular perspective, suggests that was partly, or in the majority, associated with the excessive harvesting of those animals. Now, people thought, and I thought too for the longest time, I said, how could a simple group of hunter-gatherers in very low numbers have had any effect at all on this huge number of animals that existed? But surprisingly enough, even selective hunting of certain animals in certain ways can have a tremendously deleterious effect and a bad effect on those populations.
Yeah.
And they could, in fact, critically contribute to their decimation, to their extinction, their local extinction. And the reason I say that is, think about it. When humankind first hit North America, right? Mm-hmm. There was no previous humans in existence on the continent. The animals had no previous associations with human predation.
Right.
In other words, it was the first, it was the only continent like that humankind wasn't on it already. So when they did show up, they had no fear of these new kind of animals. And so without the fear, they may have been easily hunted and killed.
The thing that I instantly think of is Africa. And I got a chance to go to Africa back in 2005. I've been on safari in the Serengeti. I was in Tanzania. I was in Olduvai Gorge, cradle of, human evolution, where the Leakeys famously dug, and a lot of other people. And I'll tell you what, we had a camp right at the edge of the gorge there that we were staying in for 3 weeks in tents. And that was the Leakey camp. And it was surrounded by 10 foot high, 10 foot wide, thorny bushes that had been collected and put there and grown there since then. And then there was one entrance that was guarded by local Maasai tribespeople at night. And it was guarded not from people, but from animals. Elephants, giraffe, hyenas, lions, all the things that, I don't know if giraffes were in the New World, but definitely elephants and mastodons, like you said. Yeah. Saber-toothed tigers, all those kinds of things. So Africa has had people in it for millions of years. Do you really think it's that knowledge of humans and the Homo species that ingrained sort of, fear that this is a predator, even though humans were really more predated on by, say, tigers and lions and stuff like that? Like, they weren't taking those down for a while. I don't know. I'm just like, those animals still exist in Africa, and they existed a long time ago.
No, I agree. The coincidence of this, this in-migration of this new species of animal, humankind, and they have shown that they have on occasion done, think of the bison jump sites that exist on the plains, and the number of animals which were killed, along with the very selective harvesting, but yet the massive slaying of multiple animals that occurred. Layers of bison have been found there. So you can imagine
Yeah.
that in certain ways, perhaps the strategies of hunting these animals were not as conservative or ecologically sound as we might have imagined.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, when you kill 100 bison all at once, you can't possibly eat those. I don't care how big your tribe is.
So, exactly.
Yeah.
So, in any case, we've talked about Coso rock art, ad nauseum, but one of the more amazing theories that were propounded way back in 1968 that have been extremely controversial is that the native people at certain times, at a particular peak experience, were able to over-harvest or exceptionally predate or slay enough bighorn sheep to locally decimate that population. Now, I used to say, now how could that possibly be? We're talking about such a small group of people with such a simple technology,
Yeah.
And when you read the introduction on the Coso rock art and the bighorn sheep, the original people back in 1968 didn't really understand much about the natural environment and the population demographics that were probably characteristic of that area. And I didn't either. So what they said, the very famous anthropologist Julian Stewart, who writes the introduction in the famous volume for 1968 on Coso rock art, said that the ubiquity, that all of these, 100,000 images in about 100 square miles, and then maybe 25 to 50% depicting bighorn sheep, obviously is reflective of a tremendous amount of herds of bighorn sheep that existed in this small area. A time when there was tremendous numbers of animals. And the same thing held for Campbell Grant and others. They said, well, obviously there must have been an amazing proliferation of animals, and the animals must have teemed, at certain points in there. Well, I didn't know if that was actually accurate or not.
Right.
I mean, could that really have been the basis for an understanding of what's going on? So I kept talking to experts on bighorn sheep behavior, wildlife biologists and others, and I said, what makes these animals tick? What do they need to live? Which areas do they characteristically reside in? What areas would they have become locally extinct, and why? And so one of them was this gentleman who just got his PhD from one of the major universities. Last name was Epps. And I went out with him, and he sent an article with me, which he sent and had published. Another one was Wiehausen, who's famous for his work in Eastern California on bighorn sheep. And Epps talked about how to predict the local decimation of the, I think he called them, each particular area, the mountain range, has their own little population of bighorn sheep. And he said that if we look all over California, what's the predictor of those areas that still have sheep, and what's the ones that don't? And the ones that don't have the least amount of rainfall. That's one of the basic predictors of that demographic.
Yeah.
Well, when you look at the entire California desert, what's one of the least rainfall abundant areas in California?
Probably Death Valley or the Mojave.
Right. Right. So you go to Death Valley or one valley system over, you look in the Cosos, and the average rainfall is 3 inches or less.
Yeah.
And
that's not a lot.
And in Death Valley, some years, there's no measurable rainfall.
Wow.
So if the amount of rainfall is correlated with the proliferation of this particular game animal, then there may not have been that many. But that's only part of the story. So then you ask yourself, well, how big an area are we talking about as a characteristic sort of footprint of this particular signature of this culture or this, area? Well, you go to Death Valley and it's all over the place. They have tons and tons of areas and mountain ranges that go forever, and the bighorn sheep can be all over the place. But when you go to the Coso Range and you look at the area where the rock art is, and you look at the area where those animals resided and we see the evidence for them, we're talking about a very, very, very small area, about 10 miles by 10 miles, about 100 square miles. So it's tiny.
Right.
Well, the other thing that is difficult there is one of the preconditions, one of the actual sort of characteristics that only allows bighorn sheep to live successfully and abundantly is one thing. They have to have one thing for where they live. That's called escape terrain. They only live where it's precipitous because they know that if they see an animal that's going after them, they can, of course, run up the vertical cliff. Right? And you've seen that, haven't you?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So you got to have escape terrain.
Yeah.
Well, after talking to a couple of these experts, Epps and Wiehausen, as an example, I figured, well, the only way to get to the bottom of some of this is to drag them out to Coso and show them some of the pictures and show them the area and try to get them to tell me a thing or two about the area. Mm-hmm. And so I finally did that many years ago, and they were puzzled, very puzzled by the natural habits and habitat of this area. First of all, there are no bighorn sheep anymore in the Cosos.
Right.
They're gone. I don't know when they were gone. There's a little bit of controversy about that. But when the base took over, there were no sheep there to speak of. They tried to introduce sheep by transplanting sheep from the Old Dad Mountains in the eastern Mojave Desert. And they brought in maybe 20, 30, 40 sheep, and they all died. I just didn't think the particular circumstances were there that allowed them to proliferate. But they in essence, there were no more.
Let's pick this thread up on the other side of the break, because we are right about there, and I think this story is just getting started. So let's do that, and we'll be back in a minute. Chris Webster here for the Archaeology Podcast Network. We strive for high-quality interviews and content so you can find information on any topic in archaeology from around the world. One way we do that is by recording interviews with our hosts and guests located in many parts of the world all at once. We do that through the use of Zencastr. That's Zencastr. Zencastr allows us to record high-quality audio with no stress on the guest. Just send them a link to click on, and that's it. Zencastr does the rest. They even do automatic transcriptions. Check out the link in the show notes for 30% off your first 3 months, or go to zencastr.com and use the code ROCKART. Looking to expand your knowledge of X-rays and imaging in the archaeology field? Then check out An Introduction to Paleoradiography, a short online course offering professional training for archaeologists and affiliated disciplines. Created by archaeologist, radiographer, and lecturer James Elliott, the content of this course is based upon his research and teaching experience in higher education. It is approved by the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists as 4 hours of training. That's in the UK, for those of you that don't know. So don't miss out on this exciting opportunity for professional and personal development. For more information on pricing and course structure, visit paleoimaging.com. That's PALEO imaging.com, and look for the link in the show notes to this episode.
Shop Plato's Closet tax-free August 2nd through 4th for back-to-school styles. We sell the trendy, gently used styles you need to make a difference in the world and in your wallet for back-to-school shopping. Save up to 70% off regular retail prices by choosing recycled styles. Save even more when you shop tax-free this weekend. Make a change that others can respect and repeat. Shop Plato's Closet in North Charleston and West Ashley this year for your back-to-school looks. Plato's Closet, located in West Ashley on Sam Rittenberg Boulevard and North Charleston on Rivers Avenue.
Welcome back to episode 66 of the Rock Art Podcast. And Alan, you were just getting into a story. We're talking about essentially the fact that there are no bighorn sheep left in the Cosos. Even when the base took over, I didn't know that it was that long ago that bighorn sheep were not in the Cosos, because that was back in the 40s. So let's continue this narrative.
Was back in the 40s. No bighorn sheep there. And so we got a couple of wildlife biologists, some of the most prestigious and knowledgeable researchers on bighorn sheep really in the world. We house it in Epps. And I convinced them to go on a little field trip with me, and we visit the rock art of the Cosos, and we had the ability to sort of go around, not only in Little Pet, but other areas at the time. It was early on. And they said, Alan, this is a puzzler. I'm seeing all these bighorn sheep pictures, but this area is not prime bighorn sheep territory. I said, well, what's it missing? He says, it doesn't have any escape terrain. Where's the precipitous slopes? Where's the mountain ranges and the areas where they can go up the verticality and all of that? There's not much of that here, and this is a very small area. And I said, well, this is what you get. This is all you got. And I said, well, how many bighorn sheep do you think could be supported in an area of about 100 square miles within the China Lake Naval Weapons Center? They said, that's a good question, and we really can't answer that right now, but keep thinking about that, and ponder that, and we'll see if we can get after that. It took me several years of asking and asking and asking, and just nudging them to get an answer. They were not willing to, stick their necks out and tell me. But finally, Wehausen, after asking him again and again and again, said, Alan, we're talking about at most a couple of hundred bighorn sheep at most. If you're talking about the area that I've seen, where you're not talking about thousands of animals, you're talking about at most a couple of hundred. And I was shocked. I was shocked because we're talking about the number of pictures of bighorn sheep that are on the rocks, number no less between maybe 25,000 to maybe even as high as 50,000 images relating to the depiction of bighorn sheep. And yet we're talking only about a couple of hundred sheep. Well, that's interesting. It's kind of an oxymoron, or sort of.
Yeah. Is there anything else represented in the rock art that's not there, that like isn't there in those quantities?
Well, they have depictions of quail. Quail are always around. They have depictions of deer, and you don't see many deer around at all. At all. What else do you got? Pictures of dogs. There's no dogs there. What else do you got? Chuckawallas. Well, there's lots of chuckawallas. Can't really, over harvest them too much.
Yeah. Now I'm going to give my prediction, because we're leading to a punchline here. So I'm going to give my prediction real quick. So I was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City last May, and I saw depictions of landscapes and, French countryside and all kinds of stuff. And guess what? I was not in the French countryside, and I was not in a landscape. I was in downtown New York City. So that's an art gallery where things are stored. Yeah. So was there just a sacred nature of Coso of Little Petrie Canyon there?
Bighorn sheep. First of all, you have to understand that the Indians that lived in this area were not prolific. They were not ubiquitous. We're talking about, 50, 100 people or more at most that are living in this area. Not many. Even during times that were a little moister, maybe a couple hundred tops. Yeah. So how many bighorns would they be able to harvest or slay? A handful. Not many. Mm-hmm. Were they regularly used for food? Well, when they could get them, yeah. If they're hunting them with an otlotl, some sort of a dart thrower, they're certainly not going to get very many of them at any one time. So if they can get one or two, that's a tremendous win. How do you overhunt sheep? Well, not too easily. There's not many hunters, and there's not many hunted sheep. So could they have really reduced their numbers significantly? Yeah. Could the Coso hunters have exploited them to such an extent that they became locally extinct? Well, that's really the key question. I didn't actually know the answer, and I was skeptical. Okay. And so I said, well, how do I approach this? How do I somehow study this particular exercise and drill down and learn something about it and try to get to the bottom of this? Well, when Campbell Grant wrote his book back in 1968, he set up a model and said that the reason there was so many pictures of sheep and huge pictures of them, life-size pictures, and so many depictions of them is because the native people hunted them out. And when their numbers were depleted, they put their images on the rocks to develop a way to ask their deities to bring them back. Okay. And people believe that's what the book said, but some people, some researchers, even a very prominent, recognized, very prestigious researcher, argued against that as even a reasonable possibility. But I wanted to explore it further, and as I did, I found out that native people have the ability and have documented the ability of excessively harvesting certain animal species, and this has been archaeologically testified in many areas of the world, and including in California and the Great Basin, the American Southwest, and even when there's generally favorable environmental conditions, human hunting pressures can overtake them and cause substantial population declines. In the Southwest, they found that happened to artiodactyls, big game animals, during the period from about AD 450 to 1050. And they found it in California amongst certain sea mammals. They even found it amongst certain invertebrates with the abalone and other other species, even as as possible such as that. So I said, well, how am I going to figure this out? I said, I think if I did a computer simulation, if I was able to, sort of assess how many people, how many sheep, when this happened, could I then correlate or potentially correlate the number of drawings on the rocks, when they dated to, when the people were there, when the bighorn sheep were there, what they were doing and how they were doing it, and could we possibly do that? So I began to try to find someone who was smart enough and savvy enough to do exactly that, develop a computer simulation that would allow us to model several factors. Well, that wasn't so easy to do. How do I find a computer simulation expert who knows enough about any of this to do this with me? So I kept asking around and never could find anyone who knew enough or was interested in the topic to work with me. Years and years I kept asking. Well, after a couple of years, I saw an article by a guy by the name of David Young, who worked there using computer simulations with Robert Bettinger. And he did some of this work exactly what I needed him to do. And I said, I bet if I somehow contacted him, I could perhaps explore the possibility of having him work with me and doing this. So I said, how am I going to get a hold of him? And I just didn't know. But he works at the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory there in Northern California. Nice. And I finally found his number and called him from time to time and left messages, but nothing. And so one time I gave him a call, and he was there. He picked up, and I said, this is Dr. Alan Garfinkel. Is this David Young? He says, yeah, it's David. He says, I've got a possible project for you, a research project. He says, oh, what is it? told him about the project. And he says, you got me on a good day. I don't have anything I'm doing these days, and I'm interested. Send me the data. Tell me what you're trying to do, and we'll work on it together and see if it's even possible. So I did that, and we kept running different scenarios in his computer system, and he was always telling me how this only took like 30 seconds of computer time, and this took 2 minutes, and so I didn't know what that meant, but I said, "Oh, that's great! I'm very happy about that." And then we began to model it based on the expectations of how many rock art images there would be, how many people, the timing of this, the synchronicity, and the periods of time. And as we began to do that, it became clearer and clearer that it, in fact, was possible for a group of native people, even a very small number, to have an impact on this population. And in fact, one of the things we saw, because there's another little number of factors chronologically that would have affected this relationship between bighorn sheep hunting and their ability to successfully slay those animals. One of those, in terms of, was of course the natural environment, climate. Well, there was a period of time when there was a bunch of epic droughts called the medieval climatic anomaly. So between AD 950 and AD 1350 would have been a good time for them to hunt them out. Yeah. Also, that was a time when they introduced the bow and arrow. On the rocks, there is bighorn sheep hunting shown with dogs. Also, that's exactly the time when the archaeologists have found that there was an expansion or migration out of eastern California called Nummic spread. So the Nummic spread, it isn't pinion nut butter, but I always like to call it the Nummic spread. But no, it's when it's when the Indians, the population demographics out of eastern California, Robert Bettinger believes it's out of the Owens Valley, began to expand because that was the hotbed of the greatest population density anywhere in the entire Great Basin. And they moved out. So that one of the places they moved into, and we know that based on my PhD dissertation, was into the Coso Range. And it's an overlay. Chances are they were also hunting the sheep and predating them simultaneously with the indigenous older Coso people. So all of these factors put together would have effectively knocked them out or developed enough of an impact to deplete their numbers sufficiently to basically not allow them to be a viable economic alternative anymore. And that's what the simulation showed. So that was interesting. Yeah. But there's independent evidence supporting that. So in other words, besides looking at a computer simulation, a model, right? We can go back to the archaeological sites and say, well, what does something like animal bones tell us about what they were hunting and what they were eating at various times during prehistory? And when you look at that data, some people, most of the people who are objective and have examined this regional database, this archaeofaunal database, economic animal bones, have found that there's a very steep drop. There's a period of time when native people emphasized the exploitation of big game animals, deer, bighorn sheep, etc., and also antelope. So during this time, it's called the Newberry period, and this is the Middle Archaic. And after that time, there's a very steep drop-off in the expression and their activities associated with bighorn sheep hunting. Got it.
Okay. So that's interesting correlation too, right? Because one of the problems with rock art is always dating rock art. So using some of this other information, right? Like what we're learning about bighorn sheep can help you date what's on the images, but only to an extent, right? Because something that you had me thinking of when you were talking about the hypothesis that they were, putting bighorn sheep imagery into the rock art in order to call them up, right? Like the bighorn sheep are gone, so they want to try to bring them back by doing that.
Right.
And people were skeptical about that. But to be honest, there's examples of that effort throughout the entire world. There's the famous, everybody's heard of a rain dance, as culturally insensitive as it might be to say that. Not every Native American group has a rain dance. But
it's true.
Yeah, true. But also more recently in the last century, the cargo cults. How about that of the South Pacific, where they tried drawing pictures of runways and airplanes or something like that because these planes were bringing them supplies, and then they stopped, and they're like, well, the only way we can get them to do that is to call them forth by this imagery and this symbolism. That a whole religion developed around it. Exactly. So there's a history around the world of doing that. Yeah.
Right. And so if we believe that there's some correlation between the stress, the stressors and the emotional association with this kind of thing, then there may be a series of manifestations, religious manifestations or signatures or identification or what have you, that relate back with rock art to what's going on, basically on subsistence behavior, or the behaviors allowed with certainly the tensions and the stressors that a population is going through. Okay.
Well, that sounds like a great place to take our last break, so let's do that. And we will wrap this discussion up on the other side. Back in a minute. You may have heard my pitch for membership. It's a great idea and really helps out. However, you can also support us by picking up a fun t-shirt, sticker, or something from a large selection of items from our TeePublic store. Head over to arcpodnet.com/shop for a link. That's arcpodnet.com/shop to pick up some fun swag and support the show. Welcome back to the final segment of episode 66 of the Rock Art Podcast. And we are starting to wrap up this topic of Native Americans and the extinction of animals, specifically in the case of the last segment, the bighorn sheep in the coastal rock art area. But we started out talking about the extinction of megafauna from North America when peoples first started coming into this land. So, Alan, what does this all mean? What's the answer?
Well, the answer is in part that there actually is a relationship that I feel can be reconstructed and potentially illuminating. So if you think about some of this in a broad way, let's sort of talk about it in terms of the Coso case first, because it has to do with, our famous guy, Jared Diamond, talking about collapse.
Oh, yeah.
And so what happened in the Cosos, in part, was a series of factors all converging together to have bad effects on the people. And one of those effects was that it appears that they were able to hunt out the sheep, or at least deplete their numbers in such a great array that they were no longer a viable economic source of abundance. Now, what happened there, and in relationship to that, when something like that happens, as you say, the rain dance or the cargo cult or this or that, the way humankind responds is try to use some sort of religious or supernatural way, ask our deities to, in other words, try to intercede for us and bring back the abundance that was there before. In other words, what have we done incorrectly? What have our ritualists done? Where have we sinned? What have we done such that we have broken your laws and created this bad circumstance for ourselves? And so how do we attest, or how do we supplicate, how do we communicate with the supernatural? Well, the way we do it, in part, if we're a indigenous culture, was we produce pictures on rocks. And those are endless prayers. Those are supernatural, immortal prayers that are memorialized on stone, showing or mirroring or dealing with this magical way to bring abundance when there's lack. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does.
So think about what phenomenon historically that you and I have talked about that parallels this. I call it, what would you call it? Resource intensification, or there's a lot of ways to think about it. But what phenomenon that anthropologists study is one that sort of parallels this circumstance and is a historical example that we can use to think about it in another way. Do you know what I'm talking about? Not exactly, Alan.
Yeah, not specifically. I'm trying to think.
I'm thinking about the ghost dance.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. Which we've talked about on this show.
What happened with the ghost dance? Well, everything happened to these Indians, native people, as you can possibly imagine. They were killed. They were sickened. Their resources were gone. They were facing extinction. Mm-hmm. And so a prophet arose and said, if you dance and continue to dance and sing and pray, that these antagonistic humans, these white people, will go away and the world will become as it once was. The new world will be made over and the old world will pass away and we'll have an abundance of heaven on earth.
Right.
Now, what did they do besides dance? Well, they painted pictures. Those are called ghost dance paintings. Mm-hmm. And we know of those in Eastern California because they're beautiful. They have many colored and have many images, and they're concentrated in a particular area of Eastern California, and they depict the world or the phenomenon. They're sort of a cosmological or cartographic map of their religious precepts there shown on the rocks. So again, it's one of those things. Now, if you fast forward this and want to think about it in contemporary terms, when was one of the most stressful times for America that we've recently experienced besides the COVID?
I mean, there's been a number of stressful times, but probably, you can go all the way back to the Civil War, any of the war, World War I, II, the flu pandemic. Yeah.
So we had an interesting experience with terrorists, didn't we? where they came.
Yeah, 9/11. Yeah.
9/11. And people were a little bit upset about that, weren't they?
Indeed.
Well, what happened during that time that sort of parallels in some way sort of the proliferation of imagery and identification and signatures of who we are. Mm-hmm. We had a time where they ran out of flags. They couldn't produce enough flags.
Yeah.
People were expressing their patriotism and their interest in being Americans. And so that was the identification, the symbolism. Also, they were running to the churches and other religious institutions to pray because they felt they were being invaded and their space was they were facing a tremendous, almost an invisible adversary. How can we deal with these people? So that phenomenon, as different as it might seem, seems to have some parallel to the phenomenon I'm talking about. It's again an image. It's a design. It's a representation. It's a signature of who we are. We're trying to manifest and represent our identity. How's that?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, and that's a good parallel too. Yeah.
So I see parallels with all of that. Now, if we take this full circle and think back to Coso, when they did high elevation work in the White Mountains above the Owens Valley, and they found these high elevation villages. We're talking 10,000 feet or more, 12,000 feet above, almost as high as some of the highest peaks there in Owens Valley. They found villages there, right? And the villages that they found were ones that they were hunting bighorn sheep. And they had thousands of bones of the bighorn sheep represented, and the manifestations of subsistence behavior of that hunting behavior there. But what they found is during that period, the Middle Archaic, this peaked, and then all of a sudden, post that time, they no longer hunted bighorn sheep, but they went after these little tiny animals, these little rodents that were up there, because the bighorn sheep were either no more, or their numbers were so depleted, or the bighorn sheep learned not to go there and get away from these crazy native people who were trying to hunt them out.
Yeah.
And so they had to shift their entire focus from an emphasis on bighorn sheep hunting to living in these upland villages and hunting these little tiny animals. So there's a corollary there as well. So sometimes, if we're lucky, we find the archaeological record may mimic or mirror in some ways the phenomenon we're trying to study, even with respect to rock art.
Well, and you can see that across much of North America in the archaeological record, right? In the sizes of the projectile points that are not only depicted in rock art sometimes, but found on archaeological sites. They're a lot bigger spear tips and atlatl tips, which is kind of a spear thrower kind of thing for those that haven't seen one. And those are bigger points typically than your smaller bow and arrow or even dart points, like almost a crossbow kind of thing. So, and those are for getting smaller game, right? The size of your point is typically related to the size of the game you're going after, because it's got to be able to, puncture that skin and get in, and you don't want to throw a big point, a big spear point at a rabbit. You'll just destroy it. It's like you don't go rabbit hunting with a 44 Magnum either.
No. And it was such a radical change from the bow and arrow, from the spear, the dart, and the dart point. As you're saying, it changed the whole basis of the economy. The other thing I didn't mention was one of the chief bases for this, this culture that lived out in the Cosos was obsidian, volcanic glass. I call them the black glass traders for the Trans-Sierran trade, and they were big on obsidian. Well, what happened to their obsidian trade? Well, it tanked because when they shifted over to the bow and arrow, they didn't need these massive chunks of volcanic glass anymore. They could deal with little tiny shards. They could pick up the debitage, the unmodified flakes that are littering the ground, and that's all they need to produce a little arrow.
Yeah.
So if you base your economy on trading or exporting volcanic glass, and it's no longer needed, that's another reason, adding insult to injury, that you're kind of out of luck.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, we are coming to the end of this episode. What are some final thoughts on this, or is there other research you think should be done in order to really, so to speak, put the nail in the coffin on this topic?
Well, this is still a controversy. People still don't really buy into this particular perspective. They're still arguing about whether the archaeological record can be reconstructed, or whether the actual archaeofaunal remains from Eastern California support such a shift. And American Antiquity articles testify to this. So it's not over till the fat lady sings, and it's it's still going on. They're still arguing about some of these precepts, also about the whether native people are the first ecologists, and whether there was really circumstances that allowed them to excessively harvest certain key economic species that they were emphasizing and reducing to numbers such that they were no longer viable, which is surprising. I think it's still surprising, but I believe that is a valid perspective.
Do you think that there's any evidence? It's not something I've read extensively about or even heard about in all the podcasts I've done and all the people I've interviewed, but do you think there's any evidence of pre-writing societies, let's call it? I don't want to say prehistoric for various reasons, but societies that are pre-literate, but they're still intelligent people. They live on the landscape. They know where plants are. They know how to kill animals. They know how to survive. They know how to procreate, make clothing and houses. I mean, these are intelligent people, but anywhere on the planet, is there evidence of a society like that, a more hunter-gatherer type society, being conscious of their resources, or with such small numbers that they typically lived in, did everything just seem abundant and they didn't have to be conscious of that, until it was gone? And then they're like, well, I guess we're killing something else now.
I think that in South America, there was a tremendous consciousness of trying to conserve certain animal species and make sure that they didn't excessively harvest them. That was one thing. But that still being said, if you look to other societies, even during the ethnographic period that have been documented recently, there was the dugong hunters in the Torres Strait. And when they asked them why the dugong, these manatee-like creatures, had dropped in numbers so dramatically, they said, well, probably because our shaman are not as effective as they were, and also our culture is not as strong and able to connect with the supernatural. They did not see a relationship between the excessive harvesting of those animals and the numbers that were being depleted. There was no, if-then, cause-effect kind of thinking. And that's rather interesting.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I think with that, we believe it. So this has been a great topic. If you guys have any questions, you can find Alan's contact info in the show notes. You can always comment on anywhere that you find this podcast, and we will make sure to get it over there. Don't leave a comment on iTunes. You can leave us a review on iTunes or Spotify or wherever that is, but don't leave a comment there because they don't let us know that there's things there. So we may not see it right away, but yeah.
See you next week on the Flip Flop Gang. Thanks for listening. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. Find show notes and contact information at www.arcpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends. This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.